I want to be honest about the kind of person I am, because it matters for what happened. If I were someone else, someone more curious, more principled, someone who read things instead of counting them, none of this would have gone the way it did. Or maybe it would have gone exactly the same way, which is the part I can't stop thinking about. My name is Marek Kowalski. I'm a forensic accountant. I don't work for a firm anymore. I freelance, which is the word people use when they got passed over for a promotion so many times, leaving felt like their idea. I specialize in what the industry calls zombie companies, businesses that died but were never formally buried. Someone has to go through the paperwork, file the final tax returns, catalog what's left, distribute the scraps to whoever has a claim. It's janitorial work, dressed up in a blazer. I'm good at it, the way someone can be good at washing dishes, fast, thorough enough, no wasted motion. Nobody hires me because I'm brilliant, they hire me because I'm cheap, I'm quick, and I don't create problems by asking questions about things that aren't my business. That last part is the one that matters. The job came through Corwin Lyle, a boutique law firm I'd worked with maybe half a dozen times over 4 years. They handled estates, trusts, small corporate dissolutions, the quiet end of business death. Marcus Corwin, the senior partner, called me on a Tuesday morning in March. He had a company that needed closing, Veldrin & Associates, a consultancy firm that had been inactive for 3 years, following the death of its founder, a man named Emil Veldrin. Stroke at 58, alone in his office. No partners, no succession plan. The firm had simply stopped, like a clock with a dead battery. Corwin said the holding company that owned the office lease wanted the space cleared and the books formally closed. Standard liquidation audit. Catalog the assets, value what's valuable, document the rest for the record, file the dissolution paperwork with the state. He quoted me a fee that was about 30% above my usual rate, which I noticed but didn't question, because I don't question things that benefit me. That's another thing about the kind of person I am. I took the job. He sent over a thin file, articles of incorporation, the last 3 years of tax filings, a key to the office, 14th floor of a mixed-use building downtown, the kind of glass and concrete tower where the tenants rotate every few years and nobody knows their neighbors. I scheduled the work to start Thursday. I figured 3 days, maybe 4, walk in, count everything, walk out, done. I was right about the walking in part. The building lobby had a security desk staffed by a man who looked at my ID and waved me through without writing anything down. The elevator smelled like someone's leftover curry. On 14, the hallway was carpeted in that flat gray industrial weave that exists in every office building in every city and has never once made a person feel welcome. Veldrin Associates was at the end of the hall, past a marketing firm with a glass door and a dental practice with a sign that said Dr. Novak, Gentle Dentistry, which is exactly the kind of sign that makes you certain the dentistry will not be gentle. The Veldrin office door was plain. No logo and no signage beyond a small plastic nameplate that had started to yellow. I used the key. It stuck for a moment, then turned. Inside was exactly what I expected, which was nothing remarkable. A small reception area with a desk, 2 chairs, a dead plant that had mummified into a brown twist of stem and leaf. Behind it, a short hallway leading to 4 private offices, a conference room, what looked like a kitchenette, and 2 doors at the end. One marked server room, the other unmarked. The air was stale and dry. The particular staleness of a space that's been sealed for years, where the dust has settled into a permanent film, and the silence has a texture. I did a walkthrough first, the way I always do. Get the lay of the space, assess the volume of physical assets, estimate how many hours the job will take. The reception area was small, 2014. 2 guest chairs upholstered in that scratchy teal fabric that was popular in offices around 2005. A coffee table with a single issue of Bloomberg Businessweek from January 2022 still sitting on it. The receptionist's desk had a computer, unplugged, and a phone with a blinking red light that meant the voicemail was full. 3 years of messages from people who didn't know the person they were calling was dead. The 4 private offices told a story. If you were the kind of person who reads rooms, I'm not, usually, but even I noticed. 3 of them had been cleaned out 2014 desks, empty, personal items removed, filing cabinets bare. These had belonged to the final employees, the ones who'd left after Veldrin died. They'd taken their things and gone. The way you do when a job ends and you need to move on. Normal, unremarkable. The fourth office 2014 Veldrin's, the smallest one at the far end of the hall 2014, hadn't been touched. His jacket was still hanging on the back of his chair. A coffee mug with a brown ring inside sat on the desk next to a pen with the cap off. A pair of reading glasses rested on a stack of papers. It looked like he'd stepped out for lunch and never come back, which was almost exactly what had happened, except the lunch was a stroke, and the stepping out was permanent. I closed the door and made a note. Personal effects, minimal, no significant value. I set up at the reception desk because it was closest to the door and had the best light laptop spreadsheet template, a legal pad for notes. I started the way I always start, with the financial records. Veldrin had kept physical books alongside whatever digital records existed on the servers. Filing cabinets in the conference room held 6 years of bank statements, invoices, tax correspondence, and payroll records. I pulled the most recent year first and began working through it. The conference room had a long table with 8 chairs and a whiteboard on the wall that still had writing on it, 2014 dates and initials in blue marker. Some kind of schedule or timeline that I didn't bother to read. The filing cabinets were unlocked. Everything was unlocked. The whole office had the feeling of a place that had never expected to be examined by a stranger, because the person who ran it had never expected to die at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. The financials were clean. Not clean in the way that makes you suspicious. Not too perfect, not too symmetrical. Just organized. Revenue came from consulting fees paid by a handful of LLCs I didn't recognize, which isn't unusual for small consultancies that work through intermediaries. Expenses were straightforward. Rent, utilities, insurance, 3 salaries by the final year. The company had been profitable in a modest, unexciting way. No debt, no outstanding liabilities, no pending lawsuits. From a numbers perspective, Veldrin & Associates was the most boring company I'd ever audited. The problem was the asset ledger. Every company has assets: furniture, equipment, intellectual property, accounts receivable, the stuff you catalog, value, and either sell, transfer, or write off when the business closes. I found Veldrin's asset ledger in a binder labeled Current Holdings, sitting on the bookshelf in the conference room like it had been waiting for me. The first 2 pages were normal. Office furniture valued at approximately $4,000. Computer equipment, aged and depreciated, worth maybe $800. A small reference library. Standard stuff. But the ledger continued for another 11 pages, and every entry after page 2 was classified under a category I'd never encountered in 20 years of accounting: active profiles. There were 437 of them. Each was listed with a numerical code, a date of origination, a status marker. Most said active, some said slowed, a few said pending, and a dollar value. The values ranged from $1,200 to just over $90,000. Total portfolio value per the ledger, $1.4 million. I stared at the page for about 10 seconds, then wrote proprietary research materials. Requires further classification in my notes, and moved on. That's what I do. I categorize and move on. I don't read, I count. But the active profiles weren't just a ledger entry. They were physical files stored in the unmarked room at the end of the hallway. When I opened that door, I found a space that had been converted into an archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelving units, the kind you'd see in a medical records department. Each shelf packed with thick manila folders organized by numerical code. The room was climate controlled, or had been. A dedicated HVAC unit sat silent against the back wall, its filters caked with dust. Even 3 years dead, the room was noticeably drier and cooler than the rest of the office. I needed to catalog these as assets, which meant I needed to know what they were. I pulled the first folder from the nearest shelf and opened it. It was a dossier on a person, a living person as far as I could tell. The records were current through roughly 3 years ago, when the company ceased operations. The file contained a full name, date of birth, social security number, residential addresses going back 15 years, employment history, medical records, financial statements, and this is the part where I slowed down, a detailed relationship map. Not just family members and emergency contacts, friends, colleagues, neighbors, people this person interacted with regularly, annotated with frequency of contact and apparent emotional significance. One section was labeled behavioral profile and contained what I can only describe as a personality assessment written by someone who'd been watching the subject for a very long time. It noted things like how the person responded to professional setbacks, what kinds of arguments caused them to disengage, how long they typically took to make major life decisions. I opened a second file. Same structure, different person. This one included a woman's daily schedule broken down to 15-minute intervals, covering what appeared to be almost 6 years of observation. Tuesday, 7:15 a.m., leaves apartment. 7:40 a.m., arrives at gym. 8:25 a.m., departs gym. Purchases coffee at Pete's on Wabash. On and on. Thousands of entries, meticulously dated and annotated. I opened a third. Same thing. Another person, another life, flattened into paper. I closed the folders and put them back on the shelf and stood in that dry, silent room for maybe a full minute, not thinking about what to do, but calculating what this meant for my timeline. Flagging 400 files of potentially illegally obtained personal information would mean calling Corwin, who would call their liability counsel, who would call someone at the state AG's office, and the whole thing would become an investigation that might take months, during which time my invoice would sit unpaid, because law firms don't cut checks while there's an open question about whether their client was running an illegal surveillance operation. I left the room, closed the door, and went back to my spreadsheet. I categorized the files as research archives, contents TBD, valuation deferred pending client review, and moved on to the financial analysis. I want to be clear about what I did there. I didn't miss it. I didn't fail to understand what I was looking at. I looked at 400 folders full of people's stolen lives, and I chose to file them under miscellaneous because addressing them properly would have been inconvenient. This is who I am. This is the person the story is about. I need you to understand that before we get to the part where it starts to matter, and if you're wondering whether this was the first time, no, it wasn't even the worst time. 2 years ago, I audited a medical supply company that had been billing Medicare for equipment and never delivered. The numbers were right there in the invoices, orders shipped to addresses that didn't exist, signed for by people who were already dead. I flagged it as a reconciliation discrepancy, included a footnote recommending further review, and filed the report further review never happened. The law firm closed the company, sold the remaining inventory, and moved on. I don't know how much money was stolen from Medicare. I didn't count that part. Before that, a property management company with maintenance records that showed repairs being completed on apartments that had been condemned. Before that, a staffing agency whose payroll included 37 employees who shared 6 social security numbers every time. I noted the discrepancy. Every time I categorized it as something that wasn't my problem. Every time. I collected my fee and drove home and poured a glass of wine and didn't think about it. Because thinking about it would mean I'd have to admit that my entire professional identity was built on the act of looking without seeing. I'm telling you this because when the rest of this story happens, you're going to want to feel sorry for me. And I want you to have the full picture before you decide whether I deserve it. The financial analysis took most of the second day, and that's where things stopped making sense. The consulting fees, the company's entire revenue stream, didn't correspond to any client work I could find. No deliverables. No reports, no slide decks, no strategy memos, no engagement letters. I went through every filing cabinet, every folder on the reception desk, every drawer in every office. There were no work products of any kind. The money came in through wire transfers from 31 different LLCs, each registered in a different state, most of them also defunct. The transfers were irregular in timing, but consistent in structure. A specific dollar amount, always ending in an odd number of cents, wired from entities with names like Gable Avenue Holdings or Lumen Prospect Group or Starfield Administrative Services. Names designed to mean nothing. I ran the LLCs through a public record search. Every single one had been registered by the same agent, Corwin Lyle. The law firm that hired me had created the financial infrastructure for the company I was auditing. That's not inherently suspicious. Law firms set up LLCs for clients all the time. but 31 of them, all funneling money into a single consultancy that produced no visible work. That was architecture. That was deliberate. I should have stopped. I should have called Marcus Corwin and asked what Veldrin and Associates actually did. But by then, I was on the third day and I wanted to finish and go home. So instead, I went into Emil Veldrin's private office to look for anything that might help me categorize the revenue for tax purposes. His office was the smallest of the four, barely larger than a closet. One desk, an old desktop computer, one bookshelf, no photos, no diplomas, no personal items of any kind. The desk drawers held pens, sticky notes, a bottle of aspirin, and a single external hard drive that I set aside for the equipment inventory. The bookshelf held a row of identical black binders, each labeled with a year. They span from 1998 to 2022, 24 years. I opened the one labeled 2019. Inside were what I can only describe as outcome reports. Each one was a single page, formatted like a project status update, and each corresponded to a numbered file in the archive room. They had fields labeled subject, objective, method, timeline, and status 1 read, subject number 187. Objective, career transition from public education to private sector administration. Method, introduction of recruitment contact via professional network event, arranged 3/12/19. Simultaneous reduction of current role satisfaction through administrative restructuring consultation provided to subject's employer under separate engagement. Timeline, 8 to 14 months. Status, delivered. Subject accepted position at Whitmore Academy, 11/2019. Client notified. I read it 3 times. Then I read the next one. Subject, no 4-3. Objective, dissolution of romantic partnership, non-cohabitating. Method, controlled information exposure. Redirect subject's personal email to include forwarded correspondence from partner's secondary account. Timing coordinated with partner's scheduled work travel to maximize isolation during discovery period. Timeline 3 to 6 weeks. Status delivered. Relationship terminated 07/2019. Collateral emotional impact within projected parameters. Client notified. And the next. Subject number 091. Objective, relocation from current metropolitan area to target region, Pacific Northwest. Method, employer transfer opportunity created through consulting engagement with subject's parent company. Housing market manipulation via coordinated below market listing in target neighborhood. Funded through client account number 091.R. Timeline 6 to 12 months. Status adjusted, subject initially declined, transfer. Secondary method deployed. Introduction of romantic interest in target region via dating platform profile optimization. Revised timeline, 12 to 18 months. Status update, delivered. Subject relocated 020-2020. Client notified. I sat in Emil Veldrin's chair and I read the whole binder. Every page, 47 outcome reports for 2019 alone. Every one described a specific intervention in a specific person's life, a career change, a relocation, a relationship formed or destroyed, a financial windfall or loss engineered through a series of small, individually unremarkable actions that, taken together, redirected the course of a human life. Each one had a client, each one had a fee, each one had been delivered. Veldrin and Associates wasn't a consultancy. It was a service. You paid. You specified what you wanted to happen to someone, and Emil Veldrin made it happen. Not through violence, not through blackmail, not through anything dramatic enough to attract attention. Through introductions and redirections, through job offers and apartment listings and carefully timed emails, through the thousands small forces that shape a life, weaponized and aimed. The binders covered 24 years at 40 to 60 outcomes per year. That was over 1,000 lives. Adjusted, rerouted, delivered. I put the binder back and I went to the archive room and I stood in front of the shelves and I did the thing I always do. I calculated, not the morality, the logistics. 437 files, 1,000 plus completed interventions. A law firm that built the financial infrastructure and was still paying for audits 3 years after the founder died. This was not a one-man operation that ended with a stroke. This was a system. And then I did the thing I never do. I looked for my own name. The files were organized by numerical code, not alphabetically, but each shelf had a small index card listing the code ranges it contained along with the corresponding surnames, presumably so Veldrin could pull files quickly. I found the K section on the third shelving unit, lower shelf. I ran my finger along the index until I hit Kowalski, M-code No294. The folder was exactly where it should have been. Same thickness as the others, same manila color, same neat numerical label on the tab. I pulled it out and it was heavier than I expected. Or maybe my hands were just unsteady. I don't know. I brought it back to the reception desk and sat down under the fluorescent lights and opened it. My driver's license photo from 8 years ago. The one where I looked startled because the DMV camera flashed before I was ready was paper-clipped to the inside front cover. Below it, a data sheet in the same format as all the others. Full name, date of birth, social security number, residential history, employment history, medical records, financial profile, relationship map, behavioral assessment. The behavioral assessment was 3 pages long. It described me with a clinical precision that made my skin crawl. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of professional disengagement, performs tasks to technical standard without investigating underlying context, resistance to ambiguity, strong preference for quantifiable outcomes, emotionally avoidant under stress with default coping, mechanism of task immersion. Subject is unlikely to examine materials beyond scope of assigned work unless personally implicated. I turned the page. The outcome reports started in 2016. Each one followed the same format I'd seen in the binders. Subject, objective, method, timeline, status. 2016 objective. Redirect subject from promotion track at Hargrove & Associates to independent practice. Method, coordinate with H&A Human Resources contact, retained to remove subject from candidate shortlist for senior auditor position. Ensure rejection is attributed to cultural fit concerns to minimize subject's motivation to contest. Simultaneously introduce freelance opportunity through professional contact network. Timeline, 6 to 10 months. Status, delivered. Subject resigned from HNO4 2017 and established independent forensic accounting practice. Client notified. I remembered that. I remembered sitting in the HR director's office while she explained, with a sympathetic tilt of her head, that they decided to go in a different direction. I remembered the humiliation of being told I was technically excellent, but not quite the right energy for a leadership role. I'd replayed that conversation 100 times over the years, wondering what I'd done wrong, what invisible deficiency they'd seen in me. And here it was in black ink on white paper. Nothing. I'd done nothing wrong. Someone paid for it. 2018. Objective, dissolution of subject's marriage to David Brandt. Method, timeline acceleration per client request. Introduce sustained low-grade professional stress via reduced client pipeline. Coordinated through referral network contacts. Concurrent. Ensure subject's social support network remains limited to prevent external intervention in marital deterioration. Note, no direct action against D. Brandt required. Behavioral modeling indicates existing relational strain sufficient when amplified by subject's increased work-related anxiety and social isolation. Timeline, 12 to 18 months. Status, delivered divorce. Finalized 08-2019. Subject retained independent practice. Emotional recovery within projected parameters. Client notified. I read that entry 4 times. I read it until the words stopped being words and became just shapes. And then I read it again, and they became words again. Every single one of them was a nail. They hadn't done anything to David. They hadn't needed to. They just squeezed my work life and sealed off my friendships and waited for the pressure to do what pressure does to a marriage that's already stretched thin. They'd known it would be enough. They'd modeled it. Behavioral modeling indicates existing relational strain sufficient. They'd known about the strain. They'd known David and I were struggling before I'd known it myself, or at least before I'd been willing to name it. And someone, the client, whoever that was, had decided that the solution was acceleration. Not rescue, not counseling, acceleration. My hands were shaking. I'm putting that down as a fact, not for sympathy. My hands were shaking and I couldn't make them stop, so I pressed them flat against the desk and kept reading. 2020. Objective: establish subject as preferred contractor for Corwin Lyle LLP Dissolution Services. Method: introduce subject to CL engagement pipeline through a state audit referral. Pro bono initial engagement to establish relationship. Ensure consistent quality of work product to build institutional preference. Note: subject's behavioral profile indicates high likelihood of long-term retention once professional relationship is established. Subject values predictability and repeat business over fee optimization. Status: delivered. Subject completed 6 engagements for CL between 2020-23. Relationship classified as stable, client notified. The client was Corwin Lyle. I already knew that somehow before I turned to the front page and saw the client code and the name next to it. But it wasn't Corwin Lyle the firm. The client code was personal, individual, and the name next to it was one I recognized. The client was my father, Richard Kowalski, client since 2014. Total fees paid, $87,400. My father, who'd worked as a machinist at a parts manufacturer for 31 years. My father, who'd retired in 2018 and lived on Social Security and a pension that barely covered his apartment and his medications. My father, who died in 2021 with $1,100 in his checking account and nothing else, and had assumed the money had gone to medical bills and the quiet erosion of living alone on a fixed income, $87,000. That's where it went. There was a correspondence section in the back of the file. Notes from meetings between my father and Veldrin, transcribed in Veldrin's cramped, precise handwriting. They'd met in person 6 times between 2014 and 2019, always at Veldrin's office. The notes were brief but specific. The first meeting, 2014, R. Kowalski referred through CL estate planning engagement. Daughter is subject. Client concerned about long-term professional trajectory and personal vulnerability. Requests assessment and intervention plan. Client has limited financial resources. Discussed tiered payment structure. The second meeting, 2015, client reviewed proposed outcome sequence. Expressed reservations about employment intervention. Concerned about psychological impact of perceived professional failure. Advised client that subject's behavioral profile indicates rapid adaptation and low probability of sustained distress. Client authorized Phase 1. The third meeting, 2017, Phase 1 complete. Client satisfied with professional outcome but concerned about emerging marital strain. Discussed options. Client initially resistant to relationship intervention. Extensive discussion of D. Brandt behavioral profile presented. Evidence of projected long-term emotional harm to subject if marriage continues beyond 5-year threshold. Client requested time to consider. The fourth meeting, 2018, client authorized Phase 2, marriage dissolution, expressed significant distress, required 30-minute period of composure before signing authorization. Noted for the record, client's stated motivation is protective, not punitive. Client believes that D. Brandt will cause irreversible emotional damage to subject. This assessment is consistent with our modeling authorization recorded. Expressed significant distress, required 30-minute period of composure. My father had sat in this office, maybe in the chair I was sitting in now, and cried, and then signed a piece of paper that ended my marriage. The fifth meeting, 2019, Phase 2, complete. Client reviewed outcome report. Client did not speak for approximately 4 minutes. Then asked if subject was alright, confirmed subject's emotional recovery was within projected parameters. Client asked what projected parameters meant in practice. Explained that subject was experiencing expected levels of grief, loneliness, and professional compensatory behavior, and that these were likely to resolve within 18 to 24 months. Client asked if subject would ever know, advised. Against disclosure, client agreed. The sixth meeting, 2020. Final consultation. Client's health declining, requested establishment of ongoing relationship between subject and CL to ensure stable professional pipeline post-intervention. Discussed and authorized to Phase 3. Client's remaining financial resources allocated to this engagement. Client aware this will deplete retirement savings. Client stated, "She'll be fine as long as she has work. She's like me that way. Final payment received. She'll be fine as long as she has work. She's like me that way." I closed the folder. I put both hands flat on the desk again, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, the way the therapist I saw 3 times after the divorce had told me to. The therapist I had stopped seeing, because sitting in a quiet room talking about my feelings was less tolerable to me than just feeling them badly in private. The therapist whose referral I now realized had probably also come through a network Veldrin or Corwin had built. Or maybe not. Maybe the therapist was just a therapist. That was the thing. I'd never know which parts of my life were engineered and which were just life. The interventions were designed to be invisible, to look like coincidence, to be indistinguishable from the ordinary run of bad luck and good luck that makes up a human existence. My father had paid $87,000 for that invisibility, and it had worked perfectly. I'd lived the life he'd bought me and never once suspected it was purchased. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Corwin. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting the call, because Marcus Corwin never answered on the second ring. I'd worked with the man for 4 years, and every other time I'd called it went to voicemail and he called back within the hour. This time he was right there, like he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "Mara," he said, "how's the audit going?" I found the archive room. A pause. Not long. The kind of pause a lawyer takes when he's selecting the right version of the truth. I see. And I found my file. A longer pause, then in a different voice. Quieter, less professional, almost tired. "You weren't supposed to find that? It's in the case section. I'm an auditor. I go in alphabetical order." I know that. We discussed that actually. Internally. Whether the risk was acceptable. Your behavioral profile indicated a very low probability that you'd examine individual file contents. You're thorough with numbers, Mara, but you don't read. You've never read, that's why. We've used you 6 times. I let that settle for a moment. You've used me 6 times. You've audited 6 dissolutions for us. Every one of them was a Veldrin client company, and every time you cataloged the assets without examining the records beyond what was necessary for financial valuation. You're very good at not looking. The other auditors, I said, before me. You said I was. There were others. 3. After Veldrin died, the system needed periodic maintenance. Someone to verify current asset status, update contact information, confirm that the financial infrastructure was still functional. The audits serve that purpose. Each auditor who comes in and processes the records is essentially running a diagnostic on the system, confirming what's real, what's changed, what's still active. The system is still active. The system doesn't require a human operator, Mara. It runs on scheduling protocols and database integrations that Veldrin spent 20 years building. It pulls public records, monitors social media, flags changes in employment status and residential address, and generates intervention recommendations when an active profile deviates from projected parameters. It's been running continuously since Veldrin died. It will continue running until someone turns it off, and since the only people who know it exists are the people who benefit from it, no one has. My father is dead. Yes. So who's the client now? Who's paying for my profile? No one. Your profile is, the intervention sequence was completed. Phases 1 through 3 were delivered. You are listed as a closed engagement. The system isn't actively managing your life anymore, Mara. It hasn't been since 2020. Then why am I here? Another pause. I could hear him breathing. When he spoke again, he sounded like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was too tired to hold it properly anymore. Because the system recommended you. When we needed an auditor for this engagement, the system generated a list of candidates ranked by probability of compliance, discretion, professional disengagement. You were at the top of the list. You've always been at the top of the list. That's what your father paid for, in part a daughter who was professionally reliable and personally incurious. Someone who would always do the job and never read the files. I didn't say anything for a while. The last entry in my file, I said, it says asset delivery to Corwin Lyle, final phase. Subject to perform audit and encounter file. Confirm exposure and document response. That was written 2 weeks ago after Veldrin died. After my profile was supposedly closed, the system generated that entry. The system expected me to find my file. The system models all probable outcomes for every active engagement. Your audit was an engagement. One of the projected outcomes was that you would, contrary to your behavioral profile, examine the archive contents and discover your own file. The probability was rated at 11% low, but not negligible. What was the projected response? Marcus Corwin was quiet for exactly the length of time it takes to decide whether to tell the truth or a useful version of it. I know because I counted. The system projected that if you found the file, you would experience an initial period of distress lasting 2 to 4 hours, followed by a period of analytical processing lasting 6 to 12 hours, followed by one of 3 outcomes. You would destroy the file and complete the audit without reporting the archive, probability 44%. You would contact Corwin Lyle to demand an explanation, probability 31%. Or you would examine the system's operational infrastructure and attempt to understand its full scope, probability 25%. And then what? And then, regardless of which path you took, the system projected that you would return to the office within 11 to 14 days to continue examining the files, because the system knows what your father knew and what your behavioral profile confirms. You don't stop working on something. Once you've started, you finish, even when finishing is the worst thing you could do. Who else knows, I asked, about the system? A few people. My partner, Eleanor. Our predecessor at the firm, Gerald Lyle. He's the one who brought Veldrin in originally, back in the late 90s. Gerald is in assisted living now. Doesn't remember much. A handful of long-term clients who've used the service more than once. And now you. How many clients total? Over the full operating period, roughly 200. Most were one-time engagements. A parent wanted to protect a child. A business owner looking for an edge. A very few, were what I'd call problematic. But Veldrin was selective. He turned down work he considered purely malicious. He had standards, Mara. You might not believe that, looking at the files, but he genuinely believed he was providing a service that made people's lives better. He destroyed people's marriages. He altered trajectories. In your case, the modeling showed. Stop, don't tell me what the modeling showed. Silence. Does the system know you're talking to me right now? I asked. The system isn't sentient, Mara. It's sophisticated scheduling software. It can't listen to phone calls or read minds. It models probable behaviors based on historical patterns and public data inputs. It predicted there was an 11% chance you'd find your file. It also predicted what you'd likely do next based on what it knows about you. But it doesn't know anything in real time. It doesn't watch you. It watches your data trail. What does it predict I'll do next? Another pause. I could hear a chair creak, the sound of a man who'd been sitting too long shifting his weight. It predicts you'll process this analytically, that you'll weigh the costs and benefits of each possible action, that you'll recognize the legal ambiguity it makes reporting impractical, and that you'll ultimately return to the office to examine the system more thoroughly because you're someone who needs to understand the full scope of a problem before deciding how to act on it. The system rates that outcome at the highest probability. And if I just smash the servers, then 294 active profiles lose their monitoring. Some of those profiles are being tracked because someone who loves them paid to keep them safe. You'd be making a decision for all of those people without knowing which ones need the protection and which ones don't. You're an accountant, Mara. You understand risk distribution? Would you liquidate an entire portfolio because some of the assets are toxic without knowing which ones? He was good. I hated that he was good. He was talking to me in my own language, risk, assets, portfolios, because the system had told him that's the language I respond to, or because he was a lawyer who understood leverage, or both. I could walk away, I said. You could. The system predicts a 14% chance of that, but your behavioral profile, stop calling it a behavioral profile. Your history, he corrected carefully, suggests you won't. You're not someone who leaves a problem unfinished. Your father told Veldrin that about you. He said it was the thing he admired most and worried about most, that you'd keep pulling a thread even when letting go would be kinder to yourself. I hung up. I didn't say goodbye, I just pressed the button and put the phone on the desk and sat in the dead man's office and listened to the fluorescent lights buzz. I should tell you about the server room, because I went in there next, and what I found is important. Even though it doesn't change anything, the server room door wasn't locked. Inside were 4 rack-mounted servers all running. Small green and amber lights blinked in steady patterns. The room was warm from the heat of the machines. The dedicated cooling unit had died at some point, but the servers were low draw enough that the building's central HVAC kept them from overheating. They'd been running, silently, for 3 years. Nobody had noticed because the electricity was included in the lease, paid automatically from one of the 31 LLCs, which drew from investment accounts that generated enough passive income to cover the cost indefinitely. The terminal on the small desk in the corner was in sleep mode. I touched the mouse and the screen lit up. No password. The desktop showed a single application, a custom interface that looked like it had been built in the early 2000s and updated incrementally. It was, as Marcus Corwin had described, a scheduling and tracking system. Think of it as a CRM, a customer relationship management tool, but instead of tracking sales leads, it tracked human lives. The dashboard showed active profiles, 294 currently marked active out of the original 437. The others were closed or marked deceased, 12 of them. 12 people in the archive had died during the tracking period, and the system had noted each death with a date and cause. The active profiles had recent entries, not interventions, but data updates. The system was still pulling information. Public records changes, social media activity, credit report updates. It was watching, not acting, not anymore. Without Veldrin to execute the interventions, and without anyone generating new engagement contracts, it had no directives to fulfill. But it was watching, compiling, waiting for instructions that might never come. I clicked through the interface. There was a section called Engagement History that showed every completed intervention, searchable by subject code, client code, or date. There was a section called Pending Actions that was empty, no active directives, and there was a section called Candidate Pipeline that contained a list of names and behavioral profiles of people the system had identified as potential subjects for future interventions, compiled automatically based on connections to existing profiles. My file was in the system too. Digital version, comprehensive, annotated. The last automated entry was from 6 days ago, an update to my residential address based on a utility account change I'd made when I switched internet providers. The system knew where I lived, what I earned, who I talked to, and how I was likely to react to any given stimulus, and it knew all of this because a dead man had spent 20 years teaching it to know, and because my father had paid him to apply that knowledge to me. Specifically, I sat at the terminal for a long time. I don't know how long exactly, because I wasn't counting, which is unusual for me. I thought about David. I thought about what our marriage might have been if no one had squeezed my client pipeline and sealed off my friendships, and waited for the pressure to crack us. Maybe it would have lasted. Maybe it wouldn't. Veldrin's file said David would have caused me irreversible emotional damage, and my father had believed that, and I would never know if it was true because the experiment had been run, and the control group didn't exist. There was no version of my life where I got to find out what would have happened without the intervention. There was only this version, the one my father bought, and I was living in it, and it fit me, and I couldn't tell if it fit me because it was right or because I'd been tailored to fit it. I thought about the other files. 294 people, still being tracked. Most of them probably unaware. People whose careers had been nudged, whose relationships had been curated, whose geographical locations had been engineered by small, invisible hands moving pieces they'd never see. Some of those interventions had probably been protective, like mine, a parent or a spouse or a friend who loved someone enough to pay for a better outcome and trust a stranger to deliver it. Some had probably been selfish or cruel or both. The file I'd read about the woman whose email had been redirected to expose her partner's infidelity. Who had paid for that? A jealous ex? A concerned parent? The file didn't say, the system didn't care about motive, it cared about deliverables. I could destroy it, The servers were right there. 4 machines, a few power cables, and a fire extinguisher on the wall that could do a lot of damage to a hard drive. I could pull the plugs, smash the drives, burn the physical files. It would take maybe 2 hours. The system would stop. The watching would end. 294 people would become invisible to it, and whatever protection or manipulation it was still capable of delivering would cease. But I didn't know which files were protection and which were manipulation. I didn't know who was being watched over and who was being controlled. And if I destroyed it, I'd never know, and neither would they. And some of them might be dependent on interventions that would never come. An introduction that would save a marriage, a job referral that would prevent a bankruptcy, some small nudge that a dead man's machine was still capable of generating even without its creator. Or I could report it. Call the police. Call the FBI. Call a journalist. Blow it open. But Corwin was right. What crime had been committed? The interventions were composed of individually legal actions. Recommending someone for a job isn't a crime. Listing a house for sale at below market value isn't a crime. Setting up a dating profile isn't a crime. The aggregate effect was monstrous, but each individual component was banal. A prosecutor would look at this and see 1,000 tiny nothings that added up to something they couldn't charge. Or I could walk away, lock the door, file my audit report with the archive listed as miscellaneous research materials, collect my fee, and go home. The next auditor would come eventually. The system would recommend one. Corwin Lyle would make the call, and another efficient, incurious accountant would walk in and count without reading, and walk out and never know. The system would persist. The watching would continue. And I would go back to my apartment and drink the wine I'd been planning to drink and try to figure out whether my preference for Pinot Noir was genuinely mine or something a dead man's algorithm had predicted about me. I didn't do any of those things. Not right away. I went home. I took my file, the physical folder, the one with my 8-year-old driver's license photo, and my father's handwriting in the margins of Veldrin's notes, and I put it in the passenger seat of my car. And I drove to my apartment, and I sat on my couch and I opened it again, and I read the correspondence section one more time. The last entry from the final meeting in 2020 had a margin note in Veldrin's hand. It was small, written in pencil, easy to miss. Client expressed regret, phase 2. States he thinks about it every day. Confirmed continuation of phase 3 despite reservations. Payment received note. Client emotional state is deteriorating. Recommend no further contact. Further engagement may compromise client's ability to maintain discretion, subject. My father had regretted it. He'd thought about it every day, about ending my marriage, about deciding for me, about paying a stranger to dismantle the life I'd built, because he believed a different one would be safer. He'd regretted it, and he'd done it anyway. And then he'd spent his last year alive broke and sick and alone in an apartment I visited every other weekend. And every time I'd sat across from him at his kitchen table and complained about being single, and he'd nodded and said, nothing, he'd been carrying this. The knowledge that he was the reason that my loneliness was his purchase. That the life I was living was the one he'd bought me because he loved me too much to let me live the one I'd chosen. Was he right? I don't know. I'll never know. David and I haven't spoken in 5 years. He's remarried. He has a kid. He looks happy in the photos I've seen online, which means either Veldrin's model was wrong and David was fine all along and my father destroyed my marriage for nothing, or Veldrin's model was right and David's happiness now doesn't mean he wouldn't have ruined me then. I can't test the counterfactual. Nobody can. That's the design. I keep thinking about one specific night. It was maybe 6 months before things got bad, before whatever Veldrin did started squeezing my work pipeline and sealing off my friendships. David and I were in the kitchen. He was cooking. He always cooked, I never did. And this was one of the things I loved about him that I'd stopped noticing I loved. He was making something with pasta and he'd used too much garlic and the whole apartment smelled like it. And he was laughing about it. And I was sitting at the counter with my laptop open and I was working on a reconciliation for a client. And I was not laughing because I was working and he looked at me. I remember the exact way he looked at me over his shoulder, the wooden spoon in his hand, and he said, Mayor, close the laptop. And I said after this, And he said, "You always say after this." And I said, "Because there's always a this." And we didn't fight about it. He turned back to the stove and I finished the reconciliation and we ate dinner and it was fine. But I keep thinking about the way he said it. "You always say after this." And I keep thinking about my father's words in Veldrin's file. "She'll be fine as long as she has work." She's like me that way. And I wonder whether my father looked at David, not directly, not personally, but through the behavioral model, through Veldrin's clinical lens, and saw a man who would eventually stop asking me to close the laptop, who would stop cooking, who would stop trying. Not because he was cruel, but because I was the kind of person who would choose the spreadsheet every time. And eventually he'd learn that about me the way I'd already learned it about myself. And the learning would make him bitter, and the bitterness would make him sharp, and the sharpness would make me retreat further into the work. And eventually we'd be two people living in the same apartment who'd forgotten why they started. Is that what the model showed? I don't know. I can't ask Veldrin. I can't ask my father. I can only sit here in my apartment with a file folder full of my own life and wonder whether love is still love if someone else decides how it ends. I put the file in a drawer. I drank the wine. I told myself I wouldn't go back. That was 9 days ago. I went back that night, not after 11 to 14 days, the way the system predicted. That same night, 3 hours after I got home, still in the clothes I'd worn to the office, I got in my car and drove downtown and took the elevator to the 14th floor and unlocked the door and sat down at the terminal in the server room. I opened a file, not mine, someone else's. Profile number 0012, one of the oldest in the system. A man in his 60s, retired, living alone. His file showed a completed intervention from 2003. Someone had paid to have him relocated from a neighborhood where he'd been targeted by a predatory lending scheme. The intervention had worked. He'd moved. He'd kept his house. The system still tracked him. His health records, his finances, his daily patterns. He was fine. He'd been fine for 20 years because a dead man's machine was watching, and nobody had turned it off. I opened another file. A woman in her 30s. Intervention completed 2018. Someone had paid to introduce her to a professional mentor who helped her leave an abusive workplace. The system noted her current status, employed, stable, 2 children. The intervention had been a doorway, and she'd walked through it, and her life on the other side was good. She didn't know the door had been built. She thought she'd found it herself. I opened another, and another. I read them the way I'd never read anything in my career. Not counting, not categorizing, but actually reading, understanding. Seeing the people in the pages, the lives in the ledger entries, the human weight of every delivered and every adjusted and every pending that would never be resolved because the man who resolved them was dead. Some of the files were ugly. A wife who'd paid to isolate her husband from his family. A business partner who'd paid to sabotage a colleague's reputation. A mother who'd paid to end her adult son's relationship with a woman she didn't approve of. The system didn't discriminate. It took the money and delivered the outcome, and noted the result with the same clinical precision, regardless of whether the intervention was an act of love or an act of control. That was the horror of it, not that the system existed, but that it was indifferent. It was a tool. A perfectly built, morally empty tool that did whatever the person holding it wanted. And now nobody was holding it. It was running on its own, watching without acting, compiling without directing. A machine full of people's lives humming quietly in a warm room on the 14th floor of a building where nobody knew it existed, except me. I didn't leave the building until morning. By then, I'd read 43 files cover to cover. I hadn't changed anything, hadn't modified any records, hadn't executed any interventions, hadn't turned anything off. I just read. For the first time in 20 years of professional life, I'd sat with a set of records and actually looked at what they contained instead of what they were worth. When I locked the office door behind me and walked down the gray carpeted hallway past the dental practice and the marketing firm, I realized something that made me stop in front of the elevator and stand there long enough that the doors opened and closed twice before I got in. The system had predicted this too. Not the timing. It had expected 11 to 14 days, and I'd come back in 3 hours. But the behavior. The last page of my file, the one I'd read at home on my couch, had a final entry in Veldrin's handwriting, not a margin note this time, a full annotation, written below the system's projected outcomes, in letters that were slightly larger than his usual cramped script, as if he'd wanted to make sure whoever read it could see. This one will come back, and she will read. She has always been capable of reading. She has simply never been given a reason. When she finds one, she will not stop. Our Kowalski was correct in his assessment. She finishes what she starts. Recommend monitoring for re-engagement. But note that subject's post-exposure trajectory, unlike previous auditors, is unlikely to terminate in disengagement. This one will want to understand. This changes the risk profile substantially. He'd known Veldrin had been dead for 3 years, and he'd known that if I ever opened my own file, I'd become something other than the woman who counts without reading. He'd known that the reason my father, the payment, the love, and the betrayal braided together so tightly I couldn't pull them apart would be enough to make me look and keep looking. I went back the next night and the night after that. I've read 112 files now. I haven't told anyone. I haven't called the police or the FBI or a journalist or Marcus Corwin. I haven't destroyed the servers. I haven't turned anything off. I go to the office after dark. I sit at the terminal. I read. I'm learning the 437 people in the archive the way you learn a neighborhood. Slowly, by walking through it, by noticing which lights are on and which doors are open and who sits on their porch at night. I told myself at the beginning that I was gathering information that I'd decide what to do once I understood the full scope. That's what I told myself. But 3 nights ago, I was reading a file, profile number 0371, a young woman whose father had paid to have her steered away from a relationship with a man who had 2 prior restraining orders, and I noticed that the system had flagged a new data point. The man had moved. He was living 4 blocks from her. Now the system had detected this through a public records update and generated an alert. But since there were no active directives and no human operator, the alert just sat there. A small red notification on a screen that nobody was watching. Nobody except me. I looked at the alert for a long time. I thought about my father sitting in Veldrin's office, deciding whether to authorize the dissolution of my marriage, requiring 30 minutes to compose himself, thinking about it every day for the rest of his life. I thought about whether he'd been right. I thought about whether it mattered if he'd been right. Because the real question wasn't whether the outcome was good. The real question was whether anyone should have the power to make that decision for someone else. And then I thought about the girl in the file, 4 blocks from a man with 2 restraining orders. And I thought, someone should tell her. I didn't use the system. I didn't execute an intervention. I didn't engineer an outcome. I picked up my phone and I called in an anonymous tip to the local police department. And I told them a young woman at a specific address might want to know that a specific individual was living nearby. That's all, a phone call, 30 seconds. The kind of thing any person might do if they happen to know something dangerous, but I didn't happen to know. I knew because I'd read a dead man's files on a dead man's machine, and that knowledge came from a system that had been built to control people's lives without their consent. My phone call was clean. The knowledge behind it wasn't I'm still going back every night now. I read the files and I watched the alerts and I tell myself I'm just paying attention, just reading, just being the kind of person who looks at what she's been given instead of filing it under miscellaneous, but I know what's happening. I can feel it the way you feel a current when you step into a river. Not violent, not dramatic, just a steady pull in a direction you didn't choose. I'm becoming the operator, not the way Veldrin was. I don't take payments. I don't engineer outcomes. I don't model behavioral profiles or arrange strategic introductions or manipulate people's email accounts. I just read, and sometimes I make a phone call, and sometimes I don't. And every night I sit in a dead man's chair and make decisions about other people's lives based on information they don't know I have. My father paid $87,000 so that I would become a woman who doesn't read. And I was that woman for 20 years, and I was efficient and reliable and professionally disengaged, and I did good work, and I was exactly what he paid for. But he was wrong about one thing. My father, the system, noted it, Veldrin noted it, and now I'm noting it. I finish what I start. I always have. It's the one thing about me that nobody had to engineer, the one trait that was mine before anyone paid to shape me, And I've started reading. Last night, I opened a new file and found a name I recognized. Not a friend, not a family member, a woman I'd worked with briefly at Hargrove & Associates years ago. Sarah Moen. I hadn't thought about her in a decade. Her file showed a pending intervention that had never been executed, authorized and paid for in 2021 by her ex-husband, 2 months before Veldrin died. Redirect subject's career away from current employer to reduce likelihood of professional success. The intervention had never been delivered. Veldrin had died before executing it, and the system couldn't act without a human operator. Sarah Moen was still at her job, still succeeding, still living the life she would have lost if a dead man had lived 2 months longer. I closed the file and I sat there in the warm hum of the server room, and I understood, finally, what I was. Not an auditor, not an operator, not a whistleblower or a vigilante or a daughter processing grief. I was the person who knew. I was the person who'd read the files and couldn't unread them. And every day I didn't act was a decision. And every day I did act was a decision. And there was no version of this where I got to go back to being the woman who counts without reading. The system predicted I'd re-engage in 11 to 14 days. I came back in 3 hours. It predicted I'd read the files. It predicted I'd want to understand. It didn't predict that I'd start making phone calls, because that wasn't in my behavioral profile. Mara Kowalski doesn't intervene, doesn't involve herself, doesn't look up from the spreadsheet. But my father was right about one thing, and Veldrin knew it. And now the system knows it too. I finish what I start. I just don't know yet what I've started. It's 4 in the morning. I'm sitting at Emil Veldrin's desk. The servers hum behind me. On the screen, a new alert, profile number 088, has been flagged for a residential change that puts them within range of a previously documented threat. The system is watching. The system is always watching. I reach for my phone. I've read 112 files now. I haven't told anyone. I haven't called the police or the FBI or a journalist or Marcus Corwin. I haven't destroyed the servers. I haven't turned anything off. I go to the office after dark. I sit at the terminal. I read. I'm learning the 437 people in the archive the way you learn a neighborhood. Slowly, by walking through it, by noticing which lights are on and which doors are open and who sits on their porch at night. I told myself at the beginning that I was gathering information, that I'd decide what to do once I understood the full scope. That's what I told myself. But 3 nights ago, I was reading a file. Profile number 00 Sir. He was living 4 blocks from her now. The system had detected this through a public records update and generated an alert. But since there were no active directives and no human operator, the alert just sat there. A small red notification on a screen, and nobody was watching. Nobody except me. I looked at the alert for a long time. I thought about my father sitting in Veldrin's office, deciding whether to authorize the dissolution of my marriage, requiring 30 minutes to compose himself, thinking about it every day for the rest of his life. I thought about whether he'd been right. I thought about whether it mattered if he'd been right. Because the real question wasn't whether the outcome was good. The real question was whether anyone should have the power to make that decision for someone else. And then I thought about the girl in the file. 4 blocks from a man with 2 restraining orders, and I thought someone should tell her. I didn't use the system. I didn't execute an intervention. I didn't engineer an outcome. I picked up my phone, and I called in an anonymous tip to the local police department. And I told them a young woman at a specific address might want to know that a specific individual was living nearby. That's all. A phone call. 30 seconds. The kind of thing any person might do if they happen to know something dangerous. But I didn't happen to know. I knew because I'd read a dead man's files on a dead man's machine. And that knowledge came from a system that had been built to control people's lives without their consent. My phone call was clean. The knowledge behind it wasn't, I'm still going back every night now. I read the files and I watch the alerts and I tell myself I'm just paying attention, just reading, just being the kind of person who looks at what she's been given instead of filing it under miscellaneous. But I know what's happening. I can feel it, the way you feel a current when you step into a river. Not violent and not dramatic, just a steady pull in a direction you didn't choose. I'm becoming the operator. Not the way Veldrin was. I don't take payments. I don't engineer outcomes. I don't model behavioral profiles or arrange strategic introductions or manipulate people's email accounts. I just read. And sometimes I make a phone call. And sometimes I don't. And every night I sit in a dead man's chair and make decisions about other people's lives based on information they don't know I have. My father paid $87,000 so that I would become a woman who doesn't read. And I was that woman for 20 years, and I was efficient and reliable and professionally disengaged, and I did good work, and I was exactly what he paid for. But he was wrong about one thing, my father. The system noted it. Veldrin noted it. And now I'm noting it. I finish what I start. I always have. It's the one thing about me that nobody had to engineer. The one trait that was mine before anyone paid to shape me. And I've started reading. Last night I opened a new file and found a name I recognized. Not a friend, not a family member, a woman I'd worked with briefly at Hargrove & Associates years ago. Sarah Moen. I hadn't thought about her in a decade. Her file showed a pending intervention that had never been executed, authorized and paid for in 2021 by her ex-husband, 2 months before Veldrin died. Redirect subject's career away from current employer to reduce likelihood of professional success. The intervention had never been delivered. Veldrin had died before executing it, and the system couldn't act without a human operator. Sarah Moen was still at her job, still succeeding, still living the life she would have lost if a dead man had lived 2 months longer. I closed the file, and I sat there in the warm hum of the server room, and I understood, finally, what I was. Not an auditor, not an operator, not a whistleblower or a vigilante or a daughter processing grief. I was the person who knew. I was the person who'd read the files and couldn't unread them. And every day I didn't act was a decision. And every day I did act was a decision. And there was no version of this where I got to go back to being the woman who counts without reading. The system predicted I'd re-engage in 11 to 14 days. I came back in 3 hours. It predicted I'd read the files. It predicted I'd want to understand. It didn't predict that I'd start making phone calls. Because that wasn't in my behavioral profile. Mara Kowalski doesn't intervene. Doesn't involve herself. Doesn't look up from the spreadsheet. But my father was right about one thing, and Veldrin knew it, and now the system knows it too. I finish what I start, I just don't know yet what I've started. It's 4 in the morning. I'm sitting at Emil Veldrin's desk. The servers hum behind me. On the screen, a new alert. Profile number 088 has been flagged for a residential change that puts them within range of a previously documented threat. The system is watching. The system is always watching. I reach for my phone.